right, we are going to talk about your heart and your circulatory system. So that you know, this chapter has 3 basic sections. The first section is about the anatomy. What are all of the pieces? What are they like? Where do they go? The second section is about how things work. So what kind of measurements can we take so that I know whether your circulatory system is working or not. And then the third section is really about your blood and how your blood, specifically the white part of your blood, can help you become immune to things, or can help you when pathogens enter your body. So what we'll be doing in this unit in terms of labs, first we will dissect a heart, a real actual heart. Usually they are sheep hearts, sometimes they're pig hearts, whatever there is in the lab. So much like when we dissected the kidney, if you are becoming ill as we are in the lab, I will not make you stay there, but I really encourage everybody to try. The hearts that we'll be using are ones that have been preserved. So this is a lab where there is a bit of a smell to it, not just meat that I bought at Sobeys. We will be doing that dissection, I hope, on Monday. Tomorrow's too short. I don't want to do a cool thing on a short day. So assuming that we have lab space available to us, that's when we'll go and do that. So for us to be able to dissect a heart, we have to know what all the pieces we are looking for are. So the diagram I gave you had the heart and associated blood vessels. And the reason that I don't just put the heart there is because your heart really doesn't work or doesn't have a function if it's not attached to vessels. Your heart is a pump. That is its job. Its job is to pump blood around your body, and so if there are no blood vessels attached, there's kind of no point in having a pump. Now, when you look at a diagram of the heart or of any anatomical diagram, I've been reminding you frequently that left is right and right is left. And it's even more important in your heart because this is an organ that you don't have 2 of. In most of the other chapters, like kidneys, you had 2 kidneys. Respiratory system, you have 2 lungs. But here, you only have 1 heart, so it's key that you know what happens on the left side of your heart and what happens on the right side. So please remember, this side is right, this side is left. Now your heart is made up of a bunch of different types of pieces. And so I'm going to split this up into sort of 3 sections. First, I'm going to talk about the chambers of your heart. A chamber is a space, a spot, like a room. In the olden days, your room would be called your chambers. Sometimes I still call it that for fun when I'm trying to be ridiculous. And if you speak another language, I know in French and in Spanish, if you're trying to say somebody's room, the word is chambre. And so that's what this means. There are 4 chambers in your heart, here, 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 and here. So there's 4 chambers, and then you'll see there's 4 valves, and then you'll see there's 4 major blood vessels. So everything is going to come in groups of 4. Now if we start with the chambers, just so that you can see, that's what number 5, number 7, number 11, and number 14 we're pointing to. The chambers in your heart have names, and there's only actually 2 names. The smaller chambers that are on the top, let me get a smaller pen, are called an atrium. Now, atrium is the singular word. You know this word. We have an atrium in the middle of our school. If I wanted to say the plural of this, I would say atria. So if I'm talking about just one of them, I would say the atrium. If I'm talking about more than one, I would say atria. You have an atrium on both sides. So, because we already said this, this is your right atrium, and this is your left atrium. Now the chambers have different functions. The atria are there to receive blood from veins. That is their job. They receive blood from veins. So veins come into your heart and put blood into the atria. Now the bottom two are both called ventricles. So you have a right ventricle and you have a left ventricle. The ventricles are the part of your heart that is really there to pump the blood. So the atria receive blood from your veins. Blood will flow down into the ventricles, and then the ventricles pump blood out via arteries. So it's an important point for you to recognize that atria are attached to veins and ventricles are attached to arteries. Now those are the four chambers of your heart. Now in between the four chambers of your heart, you have little pieces of tissue. So there are valves, and there are also four of these, just like there are four chambers. The valves are these little flaps of tissue that you see there. You have valves that do two things. Some of the valves you can see are in between the atrium and the ventricle, and some of them are between a ventricle and a blood vessel. Since ventricles are attached to arteries, it would always be between a ventricle and an artery. So point number 6 here is a valve. Point number, where are we at here? 13 is a valve, 12 is a valve, and for some reason I decided not even to number this one, so we'll just add a number, we'll call it 16, we'll call it a valve as well. Now the valves all have names. In the initial picture in your textbook, as specific as they get is to call them semilunar valves or atrioventricular valves. And that's good because it describes where they are, but it doesn't tell us which side of the heart they are on. So I'm going to be a little bit more specific here with the name of each valve so that you can tell which one is which. So this is definitely an AV valve. It's between the atria and the ventricle, but specifically, if I wanted to be precise and give it a name, this valve is called the tricuspid AV valve. Now the AV valve on the other side, again, AV because it's between an atria and a ventricle, that valve is called the bicuspid, or sometimes in old school things, it's called the mitral valve. I will call it the bicuspid valve, but in case you're reading something at some point and they say the word mitral, that is where it's coming from. Now the reason they have different names is basically because of their appearance. If I was to look at the tricuspid valve, it has 3 little flaps, and the bicuspid valve only has 2. The other valves are the valves between ventricles and blood vessels. So these are called semilunar valves because of their shape. Lunar means moon, so semilunar means half moon shape. And we would name them even more specifically based on which artery they're attached to. So if I take a look, this one is easy to see. I can see that this is the blood vessel that that valve is attached to. So I need to identify what that blood vessel is. Now, This picture is not identical to the one that's in your textbook, and I did that on purpose because I want you to see that if you know what something is supposed to be attached to, you can identify it. So I'll just let you know that because I know what it's attached to, I know that this has to be the pulmonary artery. I know that. It has to be that one because the pulmonary artery is attached to the right ventricle. So when I name this valve, I would call it the pulmonary semilunar valve because it's attached to the pulmonary artery. Now the other semilunar valve, number 13, is between the left ventricle and this blood vessel, which I think most people recognized was the aorta. The aorta is the major artery that leaves your heart and takes blood to the rest of your body. So this would be called the aortic valve or the aortic semilunar valve. Now, since to name the valves, we have to name the blood vessels, we already did a bit of that, so that you know there are 4 major blood vessels associated. I already named the aorta and the pulmonary artery. Those are both arteries. The other blood vessels that you could see here would be number 2. Number 2 and number 8 both represent the Vena Cava. This is the main vein that comes back to your heart, and it has 2 branches, the superior branch and the inferior branch. Basically, all the blood that's going to come back to your heart is going to come in from those 2 branches. The superior vena cava takes blood from the top part of your body, so shoulders and up. The inferior vena cava from everything that's below. But both of those attach right here to the right atrium. So the inferior and the superior vena cava both dump blood into your right atrium. And when we dissect the heart, I will encourage you to stick your finger in the blood vessel so that you can see where it ends off, so that you get the bigger picture of this. Now, the other blood vessels that you can see are the ones that are labeled 10 and the ones that are labeled 3 and 4. Now, these are all pieces of blood vessels, and some of them come in pairs. So, for example, the vena cava, I'm counting as one major blood vessel. It has 2 branches, but I'm counting it as one. The aorta has another branch. So here's the aorta, and down here is also your aorta. It's just the branch that's going downwards from your aorta. This is your left pulmonary artery. And over here, if we follow this picture, this is your right pulmonary artery. So because you have 2 lungs, your pulmonary artery needs to split into 2 so that blood can go to both of them. Now 10 and 4, I've already written over here over 4 a bunch, but these are all your pulmonary veins. 10 would be your left pulmonary veins, and 4 over here would be your right pulmonary veins. Your pulmonary veins, let's make a little square here. Your pulmonary veins dump into your left atrium. That's where they're attached. And so when we are dissecting hearts, you will be able to find the space in the atrium where the blood vessel flows in, and that's how you'll figure out which blood vessel was a vein and which one was an artery. Veins are attached to the atrium. Arteries are attached to the ventricles. So that sums up what is on this picture: 4 chambers, 4 valves, 4 blood vessels. Does anyone want to ask any questions about how to label anything on this diagram? So then what I would like to do is talk to you a little bit about some of the other things or functions that go along with your circulatory system. So there's nothing on the back of this sheet. If you want to use the back of this sheet, do that. Or if you want, just a piece of paper so you can write a few things down, whatever you prefer. I'm just going to make a few notes about what your circulatory system can do for you and some more details about some of these pieces of your circulatory system. So the first thing that I would like to talk to you about are the things that your circulatory system can do for you. Now the first one, and the one that we would talk about usually the most often, is the fact that it delivers things. We already know from talking about respiration that your blood is necessary to transport gases. It's also important for nutrient and for waste, and so your blood is your transport mechanism. The second thing that your circulatory system does is that it helps thermoregulate the body. And I'm just going to make a little note here. Write down the word homeostasis and remind you that this might not be the first time you've heard of something making sure that your body stays the correct temperature. Now, this is different than your muscles. Some of you are already well aware that when you are cold, you shiver, and muscle contraction requires cell respiration. Cell respiration produces heat. That's not the only way that your body can be thermoregulated. Your blood can accomplish this as well. Basically, here's the idea. Under normal conditions, notice how your blood is in the center. Your blood is usually flowing mostly towards your internal organs, helping them function, helping them perform whatever tasks they are doing. When you are very, very hot and you would like to cool off, notice how your blood is in the extremities. So that is why when you are hot, you look red. Literally, your blood is closer to your skin when you are hot so that it can try to release some heat to the external environment just because of diffusion. And so if you are cold, the opposite would be true. Blood would be directed away from your extremities. That's why you start looking white when you're cold. It's literally because there's less blood. And so the color of your skin is not only dependent on what kind of pigment you have in it, but also how much blood is close to the surface of the skin. Does anyone want to ask any questions about how your blood could help you thermoregulate? I'll tell you something cool. I might have told you this before. When you are eating and your digestive system is working hard to digest food, touch your stomach, it will be cold. It's weird. And not just kind of cold, it'll be really cold compared to the temperature of your hand. And that's because all of the blood will be directed away from the surface of your abdomen towards your internal digestive organs so that you can digest your food. Point number 3 about what your circulatory system does for you is about blood clotting and immune cells. We are really going to focus on the immune cell part of things. We'll briefly talk about clotting, but we're going to spend way more time talking about your immune system. So that you know, when we talk about your blood, we will be talking about 2 different pieces of terminology. I want to go down. How do I do that? Get out of here. There, I'll just move this up a little bit. When we're talking about your circulatory system then, we're going to use two descriptors. In some scenarios, your circulatory system is what we would call an open system. That means that blood cells can leave the vessels and pool in some sort of collecting area of the body. In general, this is what we say when we are talking about white blood cells. White blood cells are not always in your blood. I'll show you that you have some additional vessels that hold white blood cells. They're the ones that help attack invading pathogens, so this is your immune system. In other scenarios, your circulatory system is a closed system where the blood cells are not supposed to leave the vessel. So when I write the word never here, what I mean is they're not supposed to. If they do, it means there's a problem. And this is for red blood cells. So you might remember from our section on the kidney that red blood cells are supposed to stay in the blood. And if they get filtered out of the blood into your urine, for example, that means that there is an issue. And that would be true in any other place as well. Your red blood cells are not supposed to leave your blood vessels, ever. If they do, it means that there is a hole and you probably have some greater issue or some damage that you need to fix. So that you know, your blood is actually pretty toxic if it touches your cells directly. When I was in university, the thing that I studied was hemorrhagic stroke, which is when a blood vessel bursts in your brain and your blood leaks out, and it's blood that's causing a person to have a stroke. Not the fact that, maybe their blood isn't in their vessel anymore, but that it's killing the brain tissue around it. So your blood, specifically the red blood cells, are not supposed to leave the vessels because they will kill tissue around it. So these are the three main things that your circulatory system does. Would anybody like to ask any questions about those three things? So your circulatory system has three parts, three sections. You have blood vessels. Your blood vessels would be arteries, veins, and capillaries. You have the pump, which is your heart, and you have your blood. And so we will talk about each of these things in turn in a lot more detail. We'll start by talking about blood vessels, then we'll talk about the pump, the heart, and how that works, and then finally we'll finish up talking about blood, what your blood is composed of, what kind of cells you have there. Just to give you a brief overview of what's going on, there are three types of blood vessels, and we should be able to distinguish them visually. So I should be able to show you a picture and have you tell me which blood vessel is which. So you would need to not just know the definition, but you would need to know visually which one of them is which. You would also need to know about the direction. So which way is blood flowing? You'll need to finally know about oxygen. Does that blood vessel have or not have oxygen? And I'll give you all of those details in just a second. When we talk about the heart and the fact that it's a pump, we will talk in great detail about how your heart pumps. So what makes it pump, how much it pumps, how fast it pumps, and factors that we can control that with. And then we'll talk about the tools that we could use to measure that. And then we will go to the lab and measure your heart rate and your blood pressure, and then make you do things to change your heart rate and blood pressure, and it will be fun for me to watch. Then finally, we'll talk about your blood. And I like to mention this little test tube here because it's a really good illustration for what is in your blood. If I was to take a sample of someone's blood and let it separate, there would be three distinct sections. There would be the plasma part of your blood, on the top. Now, I've mentioned this before, but plasma is basically water. It has some stuff in it, but most of it is water. You'd have a little tiny section here of white blood cells, and then a very big section of red blood cells. And the proportion that you have of these things can be very indicative of conditions you might have, especially those white blood cells. You might hear, if you watch shows like this on TV like I do, people talking about someone's white blood cell count and how it's really high. By taking a sample of someone's blood and checking these proportions, we could determine, for example, if someone has a condition that is affecting their blood. And so we'll talk about blood in a lot more detail, but these are the three sections that will be happening. This chapter will take us more time than the last couple did, because it's a little more involved, and we'll do a couple of labs in this section. So we're going to start by talking about blood vessels specifically. And so we will talk about arteries and veins first, and then we'll talk about capillaries all on their own. So, arteries are usually illustrated in red. And the reason they are usually illustrated as red is because arteries usually have oxygen. Now, there's one exception to the rule about whether or not an artery has oxygen, and some of you noticed it when you were coloring your diagram of the heart the other day. It's the artery that goes to your lungs, your pulmonary artery. It doesn't have oxygen because it hasn't been to your lungs yet. So, what do arteries do? They carry blood away. Away and artery both start with an A. So arteries carry blood away from your heart. Arteries have thick muscles and high pressure. And so one of the things that I recommend to you to use visually to tell if you have an artery or a vein is this point here. Now I'll just illustrate this picture at the bottom for a second so that I can show you what it would look like if I was to draw a picture of an artery, a picture of an artery and a picture of a vein. This is the artery. See how it's nice and round and circular and it looks thick? That's because there are muscles in the walls of your arteries. Veins, and I'll talk about this, but notice how the vein doesn't look nice and perfectly circular. It's because their structure is different. So arteries carry blood away from the heart. They have thick muscles in their walls. They have high pressure. Now, if you think about what's going on, arteries are taking the blood that your heart is pumping and bringing it towards your cells. And so they have higher pressure because the pump is closer to them. As we move on to veins, the veins are farther away in terms of blood flow from your heart, so the activity of the pump is not affecting them as much. Now, arteries carry oxygenated blood except in one case, and the one case is your pulmonary artery. So just to show you what we're talking about, in this picture on the right, I've illustrated, this is the heart in the middle. And what you need to recognize is that oxygen doesn't enter your blood until blood gets to your lungs. And so the blood that is in your heart that came back from the rest of your body hasn't been to your lungs yet. It hasn't visited your lungs to collect oxygen. And so your pulmonary artery hasn't been to your lungs yet. So there's no way there could be oxygen in that vessel. That is the only artery that is supposed to carry non-oxygenated blood. Now, as soon as blood goes to your lungs, it collects oxygen. And so you'll see that the exception for your artery will have a similar exception for your veins. Usually veins don't have oxygen, but since veins always go back to the heart and arteries always go away from the heart, there's one vein that actually has oxygen. So in the section on veins, we would most often color a vein blue, except in the one case that we'll mention. Veins carry blood to the heart. I like to use the word arrive because it has a V in it. So veins arrive, arteries go away. But veins always come towards the heart. They have thin muscles and low pressure. And so you might ask yourself, well, if that's the case, how does blood even get all the way back to my heart from, say, a vein that is in my foot? Well, veins have valves. And that is another visual cue that you could use to distinguish an artery from a vein. So in this picture, you can definitely see that the vein looks squished. It doesn't look perfectly circular. It also looks like the walls are thinner. They don't have as many muscles. And it's a little difficult to see just because of the dark color of this picture. But inside of a vein, you would often find a valve, a little flap of tissue, just like you have in the heart. And a valve's job is always to prevent the backflow of blood. No matter where valves are, that's their job, to prevent things from going back the other way. Now this is really important because you might have noticed that your circulatory system is unidirectional. It is a one-way street. Blood only goes one way. It does not go back the way that it came. And so blood cannot go backwards. It can only go forwards. Blood that's in your veins always has to go towards your heart. And so to get it there, there are little valves, little flaps of tissue that open and close to prevent blood from going backwards and pooling. This would be especially important in your lower extremities. Now there are things that will help blood move. You have skeletal muscles all over your entire body. Those are the ones that you can control. They're attached to bones. But skeletal muscle contractions help to push the blood in veins. So if you have ever had the sensation of my foot fell asleep, and you start wiggling your toes to get it to come back to life, what you're really doing is reviving the blood flow. And so if you are sitting still for a long period of time or in one position, it's always recommended that you wiggle your toes, you wiggle your feet, you contract the muscles in your legs so that blood continues to flow all the way around your body. And if no one has ever told you that, well, I'm telling you that right now. This applies to you because you sit in desks a lot of the time during the day. So on that note, all right. I'm going to finish talking about blood vessels, and then that's where we'll end today. So I said that skeletal muscle contractions help push blood in your veins to make sure that blood goes back to your heart. So hopefully you all made some of that happen just now. The last point on here is that blood is what we refer to as deoxygenated. Notice the word that's being used. Deoxygenated. That means that it had oxygen in it and something took the oxygen out. And that's always how we want to refer to blood vessels that are not containing as much oxygen. The reason that we're calling it deoxygenated is because your cells used up some of that oxygen. Diffusion happened. Your cells took oxygen out of your blood and put CO2 in, like we saw in the last section. So we don't want to say non-oxygenated or no oxygen. We want to say deoxygenated to illustrate that there was oxygen there, but it got used up. Now the one case, the one exception is your pulmonary vein. Your pulmonary vein is the vein that comes from your lungs back to your heart. Since that vein was just at your lungs, it collected oxygen. So if I refer you back up to this picture over here, the basic idea is that blood comes to the right side of my heart first. Left side on a picture is right side in real life. Then blood goes to my lungs, and that is where it picks up oxygen. After that, blood comes to the left side of my heart. And so blood is going to your heart, then to your lungs, and then back to your heart. Now after that, it's going to go to your tissues, and that is where blood is going to get used up. And to talk about what's happening in your tissues, I'd like to talk about capillaries. So capillaries are the blood vessels that connect arteries and veins. So blood would flow from an artery to a capillary to a vein. That is the direction. It would not flow the other way. So remember, it's a one-way street. Now, just like the alveoli in your lungs, capillaries have very thin walls to allow for the exchange not just of gases, but of water, of nutrients, and of wastes between your body cells and your blood. This is a spot where white blood cells could pass through. So white blood cells can pass through your capillary walls, but red blood cells should not. That should give you an indication on size. White blood vessels have to be smaller if they can get through capillary walls, whereas red blood cells are much larger and they are not supposed to be able to fit. Now, when we are in a capillary, pressure drops. And it has to drop for a couple of reasons. One, blood vessels are smaller, they have thin walls. If the pressure is too high, that could cause a blood vessel to burst. Now, how is this regulated? There are little circular muscles, just like the ones that you have in your digestive system. So you have in your digestive system sphincters, or valves, that control whether or not food can enter or exit different structures of your digestive system. You have very similar, but much smaller, circular muscles around an arteriole. Now, an arteriole, just so you know, is a branch of an artery. We've seen that word before a couple of times. An arteriole, like we saw in your excretory system, is just a branch of your renal artery that goes towards each nephron. A bronchiole was a branch of the bronchi, the tube in which air flows in your lungs. And so at the ends of arterioles, there are little circular muscles. So if you take a look at this picture that I have down here, you'll notice on a number of spots there are little bumps. Those are the muscles. Now, just like in your digestive system, these circular muscles could be called valves or sphincters. They have the same exact function, but they're just smaller. So they regulate blood flow, and this helps regulate the pressure that's in the surrounding vessels as well. This is also the way that your circulatory system helps control temperature. Vasoconstriction is when those circular muscles contract. In other words, they close. Vasodilation is when the circular muscles relax. In other words, they open. So when those circular muscles either contract or relax, this will help your body regulate temperature. When vasoconstriction happens, you are conserving heat. If I block blood from going in my capillaries, those are the things that are on the edge, that are on the outside. I have lots of capillaries close to my skin. If I block blood from going in them, I'll keep blood on the inside of my body where all the major arteries are. So vasoconstriction helps conserve heat. Vasodilation causes heat loss. Now, just so you know, the word respectively means in the same order that we just said it, in case you ever see that in a question. Now, on account of them being so small, they are definitely the most numerous type of vessel. You have tons and tons and tons and tons of capillaries all over the place. The picture on the bottom of the slide, so that you know where blood is flowing, blood would be coming, like the arrow shows, through this little arteriole. Now, is every drop of blood going to go into a particular capillary? Well, no, they're very small, and you have your whole body to supply. And so, most of the time, only a small portion of the blood will go into each capillary, and the rest of it will carry on in that blood vessel to the rest of your body. Now, blood would flow through these capillaries and get to a vein. Now, I'll write this bigger so you can see. A venule is like a branch of a vein, just like an arteriole is a branch of an artery. But really, we're talking about arteries and veins. And I just want you to recognize that the vein is going the other way. So arteries and veins generally go in opposite directions. If you're thinking about, let's say, your foot, an artery would bring blood down to your foot from your heart. A vein would bring blood back up to your heart from your foot. So no matter what type of picture we have, an artery and a vein should be going in the opposite direction in terms of blood flow.